Hello, hello. Anyone there?
Hello.
Hey, Rowan.
Hello, everybody.
We're at the official start time, but we still don't have too many attendees, so I think we can allow a few more minutes for people to trickle in. Okay, I think we can get on with some of the admin stuff. So hello, everybody. Welcome to the, I forget how manyth Mimi interim. Apparently it's the second one since the last IETF plenary, which today will be focused on user discovery. So as ever, please note well and make yourself aware of IETF's policies on intellectual property and the code of conduct and harassment policies. All right, as usual, we need a note taker, and I'd love to see someone besides Brendan do it because Brendan has very graciously done it the last 2 or 3 times in a row, and it'd be nice to have somebody else take on that burden. So thanks again, Brendan, for having done that so many times. I'm going to wait a couple more minutes for a hero to step forward. And if not, I'll just do my best to take notes. All right, looks like I'll be doing it, which is fine, really, because in any case, as we'll see in the agenda, today's discussion is largely going to be led by John as they continue to take us through the user discovery topics that we started on back in Brisbane. So John, I think you're going to be mostly driving today. I think the idea is to just go through a whole bunch of questions and then have the queue chime in as we go through the deck. Is that correct?
I should probably unmute. Yes, that is correct. We will hopefully
be able to get through some of these. I am cautiously optimistic that slides 5 through 9 might be achievable in this 2-hour block. If we get past that, it's extra credit.
Right. Sounds good. For what it's worth, the chairs have committed to running Mimi interims every 2 weeks from now until at least IETF 120, which is what, late July. Point being that there is plenty more time in the coming weeks to spend more time discussing discovery requirements and then solutions past that. And I'll say again, as I have in a few other venues, if there's anything else anybody wants to request agenda time for, please let us know. mimi-chairs@ietf.org. We're happy to reserve time for you. Okay. Anybody want to comment on the agenda or suggest anything else for today? Okay, looks like no. John, since I'm taking notes, do you want to request? Your shares are in the data tracker, so if you hit share slides, then I can grant you control, and then you can drive it yourself.
And let me see if I can figure out how to do this.
There should be share slides button at the bottom of your screen, like next to the join queue button.
Share screen or share ask slides? No,
whichever one you want is fine. There we go.
So if I do
yes, and then it should let you choose like.
Yep.
There you go.
Beautiful. And to advance
it. Take it away, John. Thank you.
Look at that. So exciting. Well, thanks everybody for being here. I know, this discussion, it's a pretty complicated one, right? And I think we're going to try to still focus pretty much on fundamentals. I think exploring what some of the candidate architectures might be, and we're going to focus a bit today on both the different ways that a discovery provider might be instantiated, which is something we just really started to break the ice on, unfortunately, in Brisbane, and also a bit on what we think the relationship of users might be to the discovery process, basically how close to it, how aware of it, and so on they need to be. And again, it's my hope from this as we look at some of these strawman models that we might be able to start articulating what the things are we like and don't like about those different models, and from that get down to what some of the practical requirements might be. I'm going to real quickly go through just what progress we've made to date. And, unfortunately, I think looking at the consensus point slide from October, I already feel like some of these things are a bit stale in terms of the way that we've been talking about things recently. But just to review this real quick, we are assuming a multiplicity of message service providers, MSPs. We believe these MSPs want to be able to assert mappings, to be able to say, I am actually a route to one of these service independent identifiers, by which we mean largely things like telephone numbers, email addresses. Message senders, in turn, want to be able to discover to which MSPs out there these SIIs might map, with the very significant caveat that there is a security concern around all that the ecosystem does not necessarily trust every MSP to provide authentic and valid mapping for these. And that's actually one of the major components of the threat model. Just to reiterate one more point that I think is extremely important from the October consensus and has kind of been a North Star for me as I've been thinking about this. This discovery problem we've been discussing is twofold. There needs to be some authentication function by which the MSPs sending messages can actually believe in the authenticity of these mappings from SIIs. And that problem is probably decouplable from the problem of how you then distribute those authenticated mappings. When we think about what a discovery provider as a network service effectively is, it is an aggregation and distribution point for those authenticated mappings, which may in fact have been manufactured in a way that has nothing to do with them, or it might be tightly coupled with them. Those are still architectural decisions we need to make. Rowan, I already see you in queue, so please, good to see you, sir.
Hi, nice to see you, and I completely agree with you. And I was going to add that those authentications would be useful even on the same messaging provider. So
definitely,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're trying to get to is a world, right, where, each messaging provider may have their own relationship with end users, and, they may do their own process to be able to authenticate, yes, this SAI is a map to that particular end user. But wouldn't it be great if relying parties in this architecture could have a reason to believe that mapping, right? And that I think is the crux of the authentication problem. Okay, so we're still just reviewing old stuff, but in Brisbane, I think we managed to get through like 2 or 3 of my slides in Brisbane with the hour or so of time that we had there. One thing I came away from that is that we really need better terms than SSI and SII. I can't even keep them straight. I'm constantly saying one when I mean the other. I think we need things that don't have so many letters in common. One proposal that Femi and Giles made for maybe SID, IID. I think those are maybe still a little too close. But maybe we need something more like a routable authenticated mapping or something that uses completely different letters so that I'm not like constantly saying the same thing. I don't know if any other people feel this is an issue we need to discuss here. If anybody has strong opinions about this, feel free to chime in or send something to the list. But ultimately, I think we want to get to a point where we have terms for these that we can talk about without getting them wrong, like 30% of the time. Another point we took away in Brisbane is that discovery acts on these SIIs. We'll still call them that for the purposes of this discussion. If you already have an SSI, if you already have a routable URL or whatever that it lets you talk to a communication service, you don't need discovery. Like, this is not the discovery problem we're trying to solve. We talked a bit in Brisbane about whether SIIs should really incorporate both telephone numbers and email addresses. And, the motivation for this, especially since we're all very concerned about sharding in the discovery process, that is, in the possibility that there are going to be geopolitical restrictions on both where data needs to reside and potentially where people, what kind of information you will get from discovery given your own geographical location when you send something out. It's much easier to solve that problem when you have something like the E164 system. And when you have something like email addresses, it can be very difficult to pinpoint the geography of those. We went around this a bit in Brisbane, and while support for email was a bit soft, it was still there. I would say the majority of people felt that the scope of SIIs should still incorporate both telephone numbers and email addresses. And finally, we started talking a bit about the fundamentals of DPs. I'm going to show this slide again in a minute. The impression I took away from Brisbane was that there was general support for DPs being a singleton. And I'll talk a bit about what I mean by a singleton and what some of the alternatives are in a moment. I want to spend a good chunk of our time here, though, going into this, because I think this is really a place we're going to end up surfacing, like I said, a lot of those tacit requirements that we can then make explicit based on what we like and don't like about various potential approaches to the DP. So this was the slide that I showed in Brisbane, I think basically unmodified, which raised the notion of a DP being a logical singleton, not a simpleton. It should be simple, but not a simpleton. And, I think we all quickly realize that, for various geopolitical and policy reasons, it's likely there's going to be sharding of some degree that is going to surround the various DP functions. And if indeed there is sharding and some information resides at some DPs and other information resides at other DPs, this naturally raises the question then, well, is the discovery going to involve more than one DP? And how exactly do you think that would play out? Is there a DP you start with and it acts something like a recursive resolver, or does the originator of a query fan out to multiple DPs to try to get information? Related to this is a notion of a particular type of sharding, which is the idea that message service providers themselves will run their own DPs. And this is a world that I think, just based on the practical discussions that are happening in the wake of the DMA, but also more over globally, this is something that's being discussed, I think, and explored in some detail. And indeed, you can imagine a very sharded world in which basically each MSP has information about its own mappings that it does not share, and that you kind of have to go to that MSP in a manner that frankly probably isn't all that different to just taking a message that you want to send and fanning it out to all the MSPs and seeing like what responses you get back from that. And we're going to talk a little bit about what some of the potential implications of that are for bias, which I think will do a good job of surfacing what some of the practical requirements about DPs are overall. And finally, this question of, should users have to be aware of the discovery process and discovery providers at all? Do they have some kind of direct relationships themselves with discovery providers? These are all the things I now want to get a level lower on. We talked about this slide a little bit at this level in Brisbane, but I want to go a little lower. Please don't be shy, speak up, get involved in this conversation, because we're here again to try to surface what we think the views of the group are, so we can start getting towards a consensus practically on what the requirements are going to be. Now, I think a good way to start on this is to look at a few strawman DP models. And, this is not an exhaustive list. I'm sure, as the says, there may be other notions, there may be things that kind of mixing and matching some of the qualities that I'm articulating here. Before I get to this, Richard, do you have an intervention you'd like to bring in?
I was inspired by the previous slide, actually. There seems to be a presumption here that a DP is an independent role of the MSPs, right? Whereas thinking about it in terms of kind of the physics, the MSPs are the ones that have the mappings to start with. So it seems like, multiplying entities to add DPs as additional entities and assume these exist. So I would be, it seems like the system would be as simple as possible in some sense if only the MSPs were involved and no additional entities were required. So is there some theory about why non-MSPs, DPs are, useful, or, who might play those roles? I mean, have people signed up to do this? And, yeah, like, why do we hypothesize that these non-MSP DPs exist at all?
Yeah, so I think the next slide and those models that I'm going to show here actually try to give this, try to approach this from exactly that perspective. And if we took them backwards and we started at the bottom with federation, federation is a model in which it is largely intended for that MSPs are DPs use case, where there are several or many entities that are operating these DPs, let's say they're MSPs, who have agreed for business and policy reasons, which are necessarily outside the scope of the IETF and the kinds of things that we exert requirements on here, who just form these business arrangements with each other. And that could take the form of, if they have authenticated mappings, sharing those mappings, right? Having a state synchronization between them, or probably more likely merely having like pointers that, that I know that mappings for this particular SII reside at this peer of mine within the federation. And so if you want to try to go get them, that's the person to go ask. And that's a bottom-up model that lacks a golden root entirely. And on a slide after this, going to go into some of the considerations about this. And I think that the main one we'll see in that is concerns about bias. And I am really interested in what the group's feelings are about the kind of what the spirit of the DMA is and what the potential for bias is that surrounds that. And when I say bias, bias is usually interpreted to be negative. I'm not sure if it's a bug or a feature. I think the argument can be made either way in this, right? Insofar as, a federation makes explicit decisions about who it admits, the people who are participating in a federation, we assume, would have some set of policies that dictates the terms under which they generate authenticated mappings and so on. And it could be that will solve a set of key security concerns that people have around this. But that's that straw man model. Tim, yes.
When you say bias, I just wonder if you can unpack what you mean. Do you mean, for instance, a discovery provider? Like, suppose a discovery provider gets an SII and it's got to choose like what SSI to then hand out. Are you saying bias in the sense of that a discovery provider might have a preference for one MSP over another, or do you mean bias in terms of which DPs are allowed to federate? Or
I mean more the former, in the sense of, if I'm an MSP, and let's say I'm a gatekeeper MSP and I operate my own DP, and someone says, I want to try to communicate with someone with the following SII, does that MSP then have some incentive perhaps to say, oh, well, if you're looking for that entity, they're on my network and I have a mapping from that SII to, and in so doing, and this again, a more spirit of the DMA-ish question, but we can even abstract it up into really how we think a system like this should behave equitably, right? Is that a good or bad thing? And, is what we're trying to get to a world where when there's a multiplicity of potential routes to a particular SII that includes, let's say, for the sake of argument, gatekeeper and non-gatekeeper participants, is there a concern that an MSP operating a DP could preferentially route traffic to their own network rather than to others? Yes, Richard.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I was thinking of more issues of false assertions where someone is asserting that an SII belongs to a given SSI without having validated that the SII is in fact present, which I think you could envision being addressed without any change to the delivery topology with trust mechanisms. But okay, yeah, so I think that in my mind probably covers the majority of the problem, but you're right, there may be residual bias issues in preferential routing that exist.
Well, I mean, and this comes down to kind of, do we expect what you're going to get through discovery is like a wall of logos, right, that are then presented to the user. Here are options about ways that you could reach this particular SII. Or do we expect what's going to happen is going to be much more transparent to the user? And, the discovery process just yields, look, I wanted to send a message to the following SII. I told this to my messaging platform. I'm now talking to the person I wanted to behind that SII, right? Or do we think there is kind of a power user sense? I have other slides about this we're going to hit in a little bit, so I don't want to get too much into that weed here. It would probably be helpful if I could just articulate what the other models are first. And, we started at the bottom with the federated model, which is kind of the least hierarchical, least top-down, most bottom-up, most just, hey, we're messaging providers, we want to be able to federate with each other. You could imagine like a monolithic singleton. And, this would be comparable for the telephone number case to the traditional numbering databases that exist that for various regulatory reasons, inevitably, right? A lot of which had to do with fairness and bias, actually, when you get down to why these things existed in the first place, are places where all of the participating providers are required to provision data, right? If I have an authenticated mapping as an MSP, it is my job to go, find this monolithic singleton and tell it, these are my mappings. Now, you can still, through the security things Richard was alluding to, which I think are absolutely critical to this architecture, make sure that relying parties actually have that assurance based on something other merely than they went to the monolithic singleton, right? There would be some crypto wrapped around this that would show like what the proof was that was done that authenticated this mapping in the first place. But, this is the idea that there will be, a single point you go to. When I say single, of course, I do mean logically single. It will, of course, probably be distributed for scalability reasons. And moreover, it may still be sharded in the sense that some of its data may, in that distributed network, only reside within certain geographical regions, and indeed may not be eligible to be served outside of certain geographical regions. It doesn't change the fact that there's kind of like a single point you go provision this stuff to, right? There are models we can imagine that look like that, and they would look a lot like the traditional, for the TN case, and arguably for the DNS case for email, right? places where you got to kind of go to a single place to figure out how to route this stuff. But really, the DNS case is much more analogous to the second option here, which is hierarchical resolvers. And this happens to a certain degree within the telephone network itself. We've been familiar with this from email, certainly DNS name delegation as well. But in this case, there's some kind of a golden root that is the place we all start from. That root needn't necessarily be like a DNS root. It could be something more like a distributed hash table. It could be something more like Lost, even if people here remember the old Lost protocol. I'm sure Richard Barnes does. But whatever it is, it's a place that you go to start from to be able to figure out what the DP is that you need to talk to. And the idea here, this delegation could happen across any number of lines. It could indeed be delegation down to the MSPs, right? So you can look at the model, it's kind of closer to the federated model, where it's really whatever that golden root's job is, just to get you pointed to the right MSP. And so the difference between this and the federated model, it's kind of up to every DSP or every DP to determine what other DPs you might go consult. Whereas in this model, presumably all of the DPs that are eligible to participate have some connection to the golden root such that the golden root can then point down to them. The result being that every requester will get pointers to the DPs where all of the authenticated mappings for a particular SII reside. And yes, there are those potential geopolitical or policy constraints that may exert some influence on that. But I mean, from these three models, you kind of get at why I think these are interesting to talk about as we're starting to think about requirements around this, right? Because this points to systems in which we're really leaving it up to the MSP community who had run the DPs themselves to manage that what would traditionally be the neutrality, right, dimension of the resolution of these identifiers independently of any either golden root or like monolithic system. And I have some considerations, the next slide, that'll go into this and bias in a bit more detail. But any comments on what people like or don't like about these three models, and if they're not clear enough for you to figure that out, let's talk about it and ask questions and again, get better about it. Tim, I see you up.
Yeah, I appreciate that you highlighted that in the federated case, as you spell it out, like the DPs would sort of agree for business reasons to federate with each other. That's kind of a shorthand to me for like something happens out of band of any protocol that like Mimi or the IETF might write. So I worry that there's a problem there that, excuse me, that might be a barrier for entry for players into this, right? If I want my DP to federate with somebody else, if somebody else is a DP, I need to have the wherewithal to go like negotiate with some critical mass of existing big DPs. Like maybe in the extreme, you might say it ends up being a scenario akin to, I'm going to get the acronyms wrong, but it's like DKIM and the other email security thing where either you're one of the giant email vendors, pardon me? That's the one, thank you, DMARC. Yeah, like it's very hard if you're not a giant email provider to get into that space. So the hierarchical resolver maybe has some nicer properties in that way, in that if you're a small scrappy MSP and or a DP, like all you have to do is register your DP with that root resolver.
I mean, and that could, right? I could imagine variants of that where there are indeed requirements you need to meet to be able to do so, which start to look a lot like the federated case, right? But again, I think the main difference is just you're not kind of going through your home message platform, your message service provider, and getting its version of this is who you should talk to. There is instead something that is independent, right, of your MSP. And honestly, we all have a lot of MSPs, and there's a sense of, depending on which I choose to use of the 6 or 7 different apps on my phone to start with, they all might have like different views of this potentially even, and you might get different results from trying to resolve it on these different platforms. And so the results would not be, if I can borrow the term we use for DNS for this, they would not be loosely coherent, or at least there's a guarantee that they would be loosely coherent, which is what the DNS hopes to achieve from resolution requests that go to its golden root. Anybody else, any thoughts on this before I start getting to what I think some of the interesting thoughts are? Or should I just go to that? Maybe that'll trigger more conversation. Richard.
I mean, I don't know if it's so much a choice or a selection or reflection in these models, but it occurs to me these all look potentially sort of similar from the protocol point of view, in that they all provide like SII to set of SSI mappings. So it makes me kind of wonder whether we as a protocol developing working group actually need to think about the overall composition here, or whether we can focus on that protocol question, at least as a start, and let the marketplace decide, as it were, how the overall shape looks.
I mean, if we assume that we get the type of authenticated mapping records, signed crypto JSON objects, whatever that you're assuming, and I'm also assuming, I think I get more comfortable with that. I mean, I think there are potentially distinctions in terms of, who gets to see a set, that set of authenticated mappings, who gets to act upon them and make choices about them, is a potential difference in these things, right? But yeah, I mean, at a high level, I agree with you that these choices may be at least somewhat inert to the protocol design. If, we would need, for example, that is like the query protocol for the monolithic singleton version of this, that you might not necessarily need for the federated version, in the sense of the messaging platform could just like do everything for you, because the DP is effectively in with the messaging platform, and that might end up getting deferred to the set of client server interactions that we tend to say are out of scope of at least what Mimi is trying to achieve broadly.
Yeah.
All right, well, I'll go on to my next slide, which is not loading for me. There it is. A few considerations, and I mean, so I'm just going to pose it openly. Is the requirement to eliminate potential bias from the discovery architecture? Like this, we can cast this in other ways. We could say, as I do 2 bullets in, is the requirement that discovery should find all the authenticated mappings that a client is eligible to see. And that eligibility, if we understand that in policy terms, in terms of what your MSP thinks you should get to see, that might not be very precise language, but I think you get the spirit of this, right? Now, I kind of want to get temperature of the room about how people feel about this. And I want to try, and Femi, if you want to weigh in on this as well, I'll try to give my strong version of why bias might not necessarily be a bad thing. Ultimately the point of having a federation that determines which MSPs are participating is that these MSPs will have to meet certain requirements, for example, with regard to user privacy, or there could be all these stipulations that you could imagine could be the barrier to entry to the federation to be eligible to be listed in this. And, we might say that those kinds of concerns, that is clamping down and making sure that there are a set of governing rules that people are agreeing to, should limit and constrain, what the SSII mappings that you're going to see turn out to be. But I mean, at a high level, then the counter argument to that is, that just having a home DP that is based in your message service provider does seem to introduce the possibility of messaging platforms favoring their own mappings over others, especially if we imagine this is a process that happens as as a message is being sent. It's just kind of the job of the MSP to do discovery, figure out what the best place for it to go and send the message there. Maybe more than one best place to go, but the consequence of that obviously, has a potential concern that the most expedient route will necessarily be for the MSP to route you to an instance of that SII mapping housed on its own network. And so, Femi, do you want to try to give more color? That was me doing my best there.
Yeah, you did an excellent job. So I think if we look at this from DMA perspective that you mentioned earlier, so the DMA are looking at like smaller messaging providers. They don't want the big messaging provider that are described as gatekeepers to kind of have competitive advantage over them. So a smaller messaging provider should be able to use the discovery mechanism to find a user in any of the gatekeeper service and be able to communicate with them without hindrances. So DMA in particular, they focus on several of their EU regulations that are available to protect user privacy, in particular GDPR and the e-privacy directive. So the potential thing with the federated architecture is that a user can potentially get different set of mapping depending on the DP that they talk to. So is that something we want to do, or we would rather want a user to get exactly the same set of mapping irrespective of the DP they talk to? That is fair. Yep.
Great. More thoughts on this, Tim?
So we've been talking about this in terms of like a bias or fairness or like justice question, but it sounds like what we're coming around to is like a technical requirement that arbitrary DPs have consistent views of what mappings exist. And I worry that that might simply be intractable on a technical level, right?
So certainly because of the geopolitical and policy reasons that we talk about for sharding, and the eligibility of being able to see particular mappings in particular regions, I think we would need to build that in, right, to some degree. When I say, can a scope of participation at messaging platforms be defined that supports that requirement, that's kind of what I'm getting at, is that, what is client is eligible to see really mean? And that's definitely a very hand-wavy phrase right now. But, I'm trying to get at, is there something here that we want to say about this requirement that would help us to decide between something like the three models I previously presented, right? That's what I'm trying to get at. Is there a requirement here that we feel we can articulate well enough to be able to get to that? Alyssa, hello.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I'm in a taxi, so hopefully it stays good. I really liked the note that Femi ended on, which was about sort of which approach is best for the user and the user experience. And I really think that's what we should use to guide us here rather than the DMA. Because the DMA, I would say, doesn't even, it's open to a lot of interpretation and it will be interpreted over a manner of years, but whether gatekeepers are even required to have any discovery mechanism is an open question, I would say. It's certainly not like plain in the text of the DMA. And as we see like the first implementation from the first gatekeeper, the whole approach is to make messages that are going off platform, like make it very clear from a UI perspective, this like whole separate place. These are called third-party messages. And, you have to know the identifier of the person on the third-party service. And so, whether or not, if that's your position as a gatekeeper, I can imagine maybe unlikely to be interested in discovery at all, right? You're basically just trying to make sure it's as hard as possible to use the interoperable interface. So why would you do discovery if you didn't have to? And partially as a result of that, I would say, but also just more like, how do we design things in the IETF? Like, let's think about what's the experience that we want the user to have and work back from there. And in that case, I do think like, as much as possible, having a consistent set of responses to the same query, regardless of which client or service it originated from, is probably the best user experience. So that's kind of the direction that I would lean in. if I had to lean.
No, very helpful. And we are about, after this slide, I think that maybe one more slide after this, to get into the, what do we really think users' level of participation in this is? Do we expect users are going to get a drop-down menu of here's your choices? Do we expect this is going to be done for them? And I think those questions are also really important to understanding what it is we expect we're going to get from discovery overall. Got Giles. Oh, sir.
Hi. Yeah, sorry I was late. Going back to the fairness point, I feel like fairness is not really something that could be enforced technically. And it's really going to be like a policy layer on top of whatever design that we implement. And what we need to do is make sure that the design supports the information required to know whether the system is being fair or not, and not actually like try and enforce fairness within the design, because I just don't think that's possible.
Well, let me push back a little, just in the sense that I'm going to flip back a slide. If this will flip back slides, will you? You will. Because like the monolithic singleton, right, is the kind of design, and as I said, legacy telephone-like systems work this way for the purposes explicitly of manufacturer neutrality, right? Like the point of the monolithic singleton is any eligible authenticated mapping that anyone can discover in the entire ecosystem is provisioned there. And if it's not there, it doesn't exist. And that is designed to provide fairness. And
Well,
we could be
under the assumption that the monolithic provider is, provides fairness.
exactly. That's what I was going to say. You can't prevent the monolithic provider from providing different answers to different people.
So outside of the geopolitical policy thing, I believe you can specify the operation of one of these things, and regulators very frequently do, right? That such that, there's a set of eligible entities who can provision information to the monolithic singleton, and like it is the job of this platform to deliver all of the eligible things that were provisioned by those people to anyone who asks, and not to modify it in any way, right?
But that's what I mean when I say it's a policy layer thing that would have to be enforced by a regulator on top of whatever we design.
Richard would be able to explicate this better than myself, I'm sure, but there are ways that you can cryptographically create assurances that, right? And this,
actually, I think
you can make
Giles and Femi know this better than I do, that like the only hope you have of technically enforcing any neutrality would be some like fancy PIR thing where the server, whatever it is answering, doesn't actually know what question it's answering, and thus can't lie based on the question. But even then, you would potentially know who is asking, and so you can modulate the protocol somehow that way.
Yeah, I mean, I guess
my point is like at best, this is a very difficult and complicated problem. Like if we are going to try and technically assure a lack of bias in any in the protocol, we would be taking on a requirement to either assume a policy regime exists that's going to compel people to do the fair thing, or we're going to have to bite off the complexity of PIR.
Interesting. Okay, I'll think about that. I mean, again, I would have thought that there would be fancy ways that would be similar to some of the things that we've done for DNSSEC, in which you could create like, authenticated records that show this is the set of things that we do and do not have for this. And like, of course, yeah, whoever it is that is at the root of that security has to be behaving in accordance with the policy that is compatible with those sorts of records being created. But this does not, I mean, this seems to work for the DNS, right? Like, so do you think the DNS has a fatal flaw that?
No, I think the DNS doesn't try to provide the property you're talking about. So the server that is authoritative for a zone, even with DNSSEC, can provide different responses to different requesters.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, definitely correct. The coherent
Right, so
record exists.
I can provide INSEC records to you and RR SIGs to someone else.
Yes. Yeah, no, fair enough. My point is more that a provably complete record with provably what all the emissions in it exists and is there, but what it actually serves you is not necessarily that, if that's what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, DNSSEC, all DNSSEC aspires to do is demonstrate that the results you are receiving are what the authoritative server says,
Yeah.
including, not negative results. And, the architecture of the DNS bounds that lying, because of the caching architecture. You can lie at best at resolver granularity, but like it's nothing. The DNS does not aspire to prevent the authoritative server from lying. Because it's authoritative, so by definition, it's free to lie.
Right. Okay. Maybe I'll be persuaded that even the monolithic singleton is not a technical solution that prevents people from lying. I guess I'll say I do see a fundamental distinction between the incentives of a monolithic singleton to lie and the incentives of an MSP to misrepresent the situation in order to, prefer routes that are local to its service versus ones that exist in competing platforms. But Alyssa?
Yeah, two additional thoughts. One is like, if you could get there, the gatekeeper can still, through user interface design, create a bias. Like they can filter out results that before they get displayed or whatever. So like, I just think that's a little bit of a game that's it's too hard to play at the protocol level, sort of as Giles was saying. On the other hand, I do think this raises like a really good question that we should continue to ask of all of our efforts in this working group. So I'm contradicting myself a little bit, but just like this is a really good question to bring up about various other design aspects as well, in terms of like how much power does it give the gatekeeper to try to preference itself, or the flip side, to make the competing provider, to make things harder for the competing provider. And I'm sure that there's already like decisions that we've made that have interesting answers to this question. So I really appreciate you like bringing it up.
Yeah, well, and what I'm trying to surface here is there in fact some requirement around this? And like I said, we're going to talk about users in a minute. And we can imagine, for example, models in which users are the only people that ever talk to DPs. That is, clients are, and that in fact they go around MSPs entirely, and they just present the MSP. Well, this authenticated mapping is the one I've chosen. I want you to use to make sure that my messages get routed, right? And that's all that the MSP sees of these things. So when you think about these, unfortunately, they are all contingent on what our interpretation is of the relationship of either platforms or users with DPs. And we're going to get to that in a sec. But yeah, this is indeed what I'm trying to get to. So if anybody reacting to this, either in real time here or afterwards on the list, thinks there's something useful that we can say about a requirement around this, that's what I'm actually trying to get at by talking about these models. I'm not proposing that we endorse any one of the three models in the previous slide, but I think they're really useful for us to look at them and say what we like and don't like about them, so that we can turn those likes and dislikes into potentially requirements for this going forward. I also want to take a little digression talking about the DPs here to get into just how bad authenticated TN mappings are. And this relates, unfortunately, to the fact that TN routing is based on this very complicated and very jurisdictionally diverse system of databases that are responsible for ascertaining which particular providers at any given moment have authority for telephone numbers. We know when we talk about SIIs here, we're usually talking about them in a way that is decoupled from that, which is the carrier, for example, that is the carrier of record for this number at any given moment. There are, of course, systems that are messaging systems that are not in that way decoupled, and these would be traditional SMS and MMS systems and things like it, that interoperability with them may or may not be priorities for people here. But the main thing that I want to make sure people appreciate about this is that when we talk about provisioning these mappings, whether provisioning them at a monolithic singleton, somewhere in a hierarchical resolution system, or even like down at the MSP level, like at least the way this works today in large scale systems like GSMA Pathfinder, these are systems which routes MMS traffic for those not familiar with it. These are systems that have to dip real-time databases that have like commercial, impact to dip them in order to be able to route these messages. And, the notion that we're just going to be able to like hoover up the complete set of data that is required, especially for authenticated TN mappings, and stick it in any one of those three places is something that I have a bit of skepticism about. And we can talk about that, whatever level of detail people think is necessary. But I at least just want to put out there that there may be fanciness or layers of indirection or modularity that are required to actually make that integration meaningful. So those are my considerations on DPs. Any final thoughts on DPs before we move on to the closely related question about queries, where they come from, what we think they're supposed to do, and everything else? Do people feel like we actually resolved anything in this discussion? Did we make any progress in this? Is there anything people, having talked for 50 minutes now about discovery providers, anything people want to propose as a conclusion or direction from this? Melissa.
Well, I am, we heard from a few people, I think, about this question of whether in general a given user should get the same, whether users who make the same query should get approximately the same response. But maybe that's a good question to ask people. Like, do people agree with that? Or is that coming up in
what
your
do people
next
think about that?
slide? Okay.
We are going to get to some things related to that, Richard.
Yeah, I mean, that seems like a sane objective. I might lean a bit hard on the approximately there. Because as I said, having hard guarantees entails some complicated cryptography, which may or may not be worth the effort.
Well, and as we keep saying, like, there are geopolitical concerns that might mean if you're asking this question in the US, we get a different answer than if you're asking it in Europe. And I don't think we can, necessarily stipulate anything that is going to fly in the face of that without creating a system that probably isn't going to have much real world efficacy. Anybody else final thoughts on DPs before I move on? Richard?
I'll also respond because Brendan, based on something Brendan's saying in the chat, again, I may be relying a bit hard on the presumed authentication properties of these mappings, but it seems like the main bias question here is, at least at the kind of base layer, is denying access to mappings, not so much asserting false mappings. So if we assume the records are authentic, you can't assert false mappings, but you may be able to suppress someone in the path who knows what's being asked, who has got enough information to vary its behavior, could choose to suppress certain records. And so if Brendan's on the audio, that's kind of why I'm less concerned about these asserting false things than you would have in a traditional KT context. But I think that puts a slightly finer point on the bias thing. I mean, this may be on later slides, but if we have more automatic routing happening, distinguishing between multiple results, there may be some, manipulation of that could go on. But like, at least at the base layer, we're talking about suppressing information as opposed to synthesizing bad stuff.
Well, and it might not even be that the DP knows. The DP just may not be talking to another DP that knows for whatever policy or principle reason. And so when we talk about suppression, there's kind of suppression, and then there's a sort of lazy ignorance, right? Of like, I'm not even in what those set of people over there might have for authenticated mappings. And so I'm not suppressing them, but they just don't have to be part of my clique. Right. I think that is unfortunately the much more likely scenario than that. Oh, I know this mapping exists, but you know what? I'm going to hide it from this. Like, you know, there are many, you know, levels of gray between those two extremes there. Oh, Giles? Sorry. Right.
Again, I think that problem is almost infinitely easier to solve at the policy and regulation level than it is at the technical level. You know, if we're envisaging these federations being governed by a set of business agreements, then presumably those business agreements would have prohibitions on introducing bias into your results, and so would some regulators' rules as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would go further that any of these, anything besides the kind of base protocol presumes some policy regime to enforce it. Because even if you envision a golden root in your architecture, like there's nothing that says that there's. I mean, the DNS doesn't have one root, right? Like in principle it does, but in practice it doesn't.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Anybody who has experience with enum is well aware there are golden roots, and then there's the way things actually work. All right. Why don't we, as we're getting towards the halfway point here of the call, shift gears a little bit, though I think we're going to find once we start talking a bit about users here and their relationship to the DPs, we're going to be having a very similar conversation to what we were just having. But before we get to that, you know, I think there are some important questions to ask about discovery and when we think it gets invoked in the first place, and kind of what we think happens to the results of discovery. And, you know, I don't know if people have views about this in the abstract. Maybe we'll only need to get into the various models that I'm going to describe in the next couple slides after this before people start having strong opinions about this. But just at a high level, you know, when do we think discovery happens? There have been a couple of proposals for this that have been circulated that include things like, well, discovery is a function when I decide I'm going to try to send a message to Richard, and I have Richard's SII, and I send that to my message platform and say, please route this. That's when discovery gets invoked. It's when a message is about to be sent. And it has an interaction, as I said, with kind of the way that some of, especially for telephone numbers, this there's a real-time component to routing, or at least there's a required real-time component to routing for traditional messaging, like for MMS today, such that like you would need to do that check at that time anyway to make sure that whatever mapping is valid just then when you're sending it. But an alternative model is one where it could be just at a time that you're like picking friends on your messaging system, right? You and someone else choose to follow each other or whatever, open each other up to DMs, you know, or based on just what a contact book is when you first register, it kind of goes out and floods and says, okay, it's Discovery's job then to figure out who all those people are, because you need to subscribe to them to get like presence effects or something that we're used to from messaging platforms. These would be activity detectors, or whether people are marking themselves as currently green or red for availability for messaging. You know, if you need those kinds of features to be integrated, then obviously it's not just on message sending time that you invoke the discovery function, but that needs to be invoked and perhaps continually refreshed to kind of measure your entire social graph out and figure out how to get into contact with all those people. Do people have strong feelings about this? Like, is the scope of discovery as we understand it one that is really about, okay, it's time for me to send a message, like, great, then discovery needs to be done so we can figure out how to get, you know, a message to the user behind that SII? Or do we see this more in the latter sense of, or you know, it obviously could be both, but you know, I think we end up with a different scope in some respects, and potentially this will be impactful to ways we think about who performs the discovery function and why, if we make, if we limit the scope to say one or the other of these. So any thoughts? Not just here to monologue about it. I know people have opinions about this. Melissa.
Sorry, my connection is getting bad. Well, my instinct is what we can define here. Ideally, we would have building blocks that support both of these. Like it's not really up to us to decide one way or the other, I don't think. And I think there will be providers interested in one or the other or both or neither, as I said before. So I don't really think we should try to choose between these. I think we have to assume that both of these modes are of interest.
Okay, good. Rowan?
We've got we have a consent mechanism that I proposed in the protocol document that is designed for models where you have a sort of a connection oriented interaction with a new party, and which can also apply to things like you have somebody in an address book, or you have a consent which is granted based on your presence in a particular organization or a group within that organization. So I'm not sure to what extent. I think you already have. I think that consent is based on the internal identifier and not based on the external identifier. But I think that model, I just if we're making decisions in this particular way, I just want to make sure that we don't disturb that work going on over there.
Yeah. And so, a consent model like that is just the implementation of how we establish that contact relationship, right? When two parties agree that they're going to be contacts with each other, they're able to share messages, they're able to share presence, that sort of thing.
They're able to, for example, like in the MLS context, they're able to get key packages so that they can be added to new groups or what have you, right? So it's not an all or nothing consent. It can be a consent that says Rowan allows John Peterson to add me to any group, or it could be that I allow John Peterson to add me to this specific group or these 5 specific groups.
Right. No, makes sense. Tim?
Yeah, Rowan brought up MLS, which is what I was thinking about as well. In that, in some sense to me, like the job of discovery is to get a user to a point where they can start sending MLS protected application messages to some other user. And that application message could be like an actual DM, right? Some text that they're sending. Or maybe what's in that application message is that like I added you as a contact and now I'm getting like your portrait picture and maybe some other stuff that comes in a contact card. But either way, we'd want that to be protected by the MLS cryptography. So I think I'm echoing Alyssa's point in that, to some extent, from Mimi's point of view, like it doesn't really matter. Maybe there's no distinction. Like the point is to establish a cryptographic context between users, and whether the application wants to whether the first thing that the application wants to do with that context is exchange contact cards or exchange like text messages, might not matter that much to Mimi.
Okay. And that is useful. And it's useful as well as we add another wrinkle to this, which is the possibility that, in fact, you're going to end up with a multiplicity of potential authenticated mappings for a particular SII. And, you know, I am very interested in what the implications of this are for how those kinds of relationships, especially the kind of, okay, we agree to be contact with each other, play out, and what we expect the job of the client versus the MSP, the messaging platform, is when a multiplicity of mappings exists. And, you know, the fundamental questions around this are things like, you know, okay, if I want to send a message to a particular SII and there are 15 choices, and for me, there probably are like 15 choices. If you could get all of the different services that are behind my SIIs, there's probably like quite a few of them. What do we expect from a user perspective? Getting back to Alyssa's point about that, should happen in those cases. Is this a case, especially when I'm just saying, I just want to send a message to Alyssa? You know, I'm using Wire as my client, and you know, Alyssa is on multiple systems, and I just want this message to get to her. Like, is this a case where the system should prompt me as the user and say, well, here's these 6 choices? Or, you know, do we imagine more of a model where the message platform, perhaps, is the entity that looks at those 6 things and makes a decision between them? This obviously would reintroduce some of the things about potential bias I was talking about a moment ago. Do we think, you know, these things should kind of fan out between those 6 potential choices? And, you know, really, whose job is it to narrow these things down? And this is my way of teeing up a few more models that I think I am going to be showing on the next slide. But before I get to that, I mean, are there any intuitions people have about what the right user experience is for this case? Mr. Barnes.
I think the point Rowan raised about consent here could be useful here as well, in the sense that that consent signal can serve as a routing guide. If, you know, the only thing Discovery initiates is a request to get in touch, right? So maybe when John tries to, you know, to message me the first time, I get 15 consent requests on all my apps, and then I respond to him on one, and that solves the routing question. And the point of that is that at that point, the routing, you know, it's fan out at the consent stage, but you know, the routing is not done. The routing decision is not made at the discovery stage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I mean, if you consent on more than one platform, I mean, I feel like today, you know, I have consented to communicate with you on more than one platform already. Like, you know, like what? So let's just say, what has happened if that's the case?
I mean, you're just like back in the soup like you are today. Yeah, it's something you'd have to work out for sure.
I mean, the soup there is, I think, one of the hardest things about looking at this entire discovery problem. Is that there is that soup, that we are all on all of these different platforms today. And I personally don't have preferences. I do have a slide about preferences that we may or may not get to today. Like, I don't really care like which one of these. There's some that it might empirically turn out I'm more likely to reply to than others. But like, that's not even a preference in my case. There's nothing conscious that I do that makes me prefer like this or that. It just is based on all these like contingent factors.
I think if you look at some of the social science that's been done on this, you may not be representative on that. I think people do tend to be a little bit more selective. I'll try and find some citations, but I think that's the state of the.
That would be useful. Alyssa. Alyssa? I know Alyssa was kind of breaking up a bit earlier. No, I think Alyssa is going gray or something there. Okay. Well, we may move on then, and if Alyssa can join us. Are you back, Alyssa? Okay. We will advance slides here.
Yeah.
Oh, Tim, sorry, are you in?
I was going to say we should move on, and we can ask Alyssa what she was going to say if and when she can rejoin the call.
Can you hear me?
Oh, now we can. No.
Go ahead.
Sorry, this is a virtual meeting again. Granted, it's terrible. So, well, I was going to say, I do think this is probably a place where like more user research would be helpful. I don't think anyone has a ton of empirics on this, and that seems like a real gap. But back in the day, back last year, I do believe Giles had an interesting proposal around user preference. So maybe you're going to get to that. But that seems like pretty key to me is to figure out the incorporation of the recipient's preference. And again, I think that's like one mode that I could imagine some providers wanting to operate in, where they respect the recipient's preference, and you can say, this is my top choice, and I always want to receive messages on wire if I can. I don't think that would be the only mode that anybody would operate in, and you have to then accommodate the situation where the user hasn't expressed a preference and you're back in the soup, as you said. But I do think that was an interesting proposal that's worth considering.
Yeah, if I remember rightly, the proposal was to add a bit to the key distribution record that says this mapping is the one that I prefer to receive, or this key is the one that I prefer to receive messages on.
Yeah, well, we do have a slide about user preference, and it's honestly, it's another place I think is very messy in this. It's definitely in Richard's soup, in the sense that you know, what it will entail to express those, who's responsible for reconciling them with, you know, both the sender's preference and receiver's preference, and how is this turning into an offer answer like capability negotiation or capability preference thing. You know, this is a very interesting area for us to explore and figure out kind of what our appetite is to be able to articulate systems like that. Guys got more.
Again, going back to the discussion about fairness in the previous couple of slides back, again, I think it's not possible to enforce that any particular architecture or any particular instance of the architecture does exactly what the user would want them to do. I think the best we can do is, you know, provide the information and the options that would allow a application layer to build something that's kind of optimal for users. But I don't think we can sort of enforce fairness again.
Well, yeah, I think it's a little different than fairness. I mean, I think this comes down, and I don't want to skip quite ahead to this yet, but I'm going to give a little preview at least. This comes down to the question of, you know, if there are systems that are predicated on both capability and preference, where it's not just a question of what systems I prefer, but what are the set of systems you and I have in common that we are capable of communicating over, which is where a lot of these things, I think, end up. Okay, so my preference is that people talk to me on wire, and, you know, you don't have wire. Okay, like what do we think Mimi's job actually is? I never thought Mimi's job was for, you know, us to negotiate that wire is the application both of us need to be using in order to talk, right? Like, I thought it was, there's going to be an interoperability sprocket that is going to sit, you know, between services that people want to use, there, where you don't have to leave the MSP that you're on in order to be able to communicate with people that are using potentially like gatekeeper systems, for example. And that at least is something I took away as spirit of DMA very early on in this process, although people that know it better than me should obviously correct me if I misunderstood it. And so as soon as we start getting into those kinds of preferences, they're like, well, I want to be talked to on this platform, then I get nervous about what we really think the interoperability that we're designing here is supposed to do. I see lots of people in queue on that. That's good, because we should have this discussion. Yes, Tim.
Okay, so we've been talking so far, right, about a mapping of an SII to a user's SSI that is with respect to some MSP. And I think implicitly we're trusting the MSP to like create that mapping. So my concern is if we're talking about attaching a bit to one of these mappings that says, you know, you can find Tim at thing.com at some iMessage like identifier. And then there's a bit in there that says, also, this is Tim's preferred means of being reached. Well, who's authenticating that bit? Isn't it the MSP? And at that point, why wouldn't, like, every MSP could just lie and say, like, no, I'm totally the preferred thing for John. Absent that, if you wanted to do better, you would need some like preference bit signing key, public key that every user has, but that's like above the MSPs, and there is no such identity system. And like, certainly, I'm happy to speak as chair on this. Mimi is not going to design that identity system. Go ahead, Doug.
Well, I mean, the design that we had was that the user would sign it with the private key of the whatever service that it is that's got the preferred bit, which would not allow the service provider to game that. The user, only the user can do that. It doesn't resolve cases where you've got two bits that are signed by different keys that are owned by the same user, but
yes, there's that. Yeah, we definitely want to look at three-way relationships here between whatever the message platform is, the user, and like something that validates the identity as a component of the authenticated mapping. But I agree, even that does not beat the possibility that users, could express preferences for multiple platforms. We expect we're going to rank them or whatever. This could get pretty gnarly. Tim, were you back in on this, or are we moving over to Alyssa?
No, let's hear from Alyssa.
Okay. Alyssa, sorry. Nope, Alyssa's logging in and out again. Her preferred method of being reached is not in a taxi. That we can say for user preference. Okay. We will get her, I'm sure, as soon as I switch slides to the next one. She will suddenly be able to talk. So why don't we do that in order to help her get connected? Okay. So, I mean, the way that I think I found most useful for trying to figure out what I thought about this set of issues was to start asking questions about who we expected to invoke the discovery service and kind of who, what the relationship is to discovery providers from users. And, I'd like to preface the three high-level hubs I'm going to show by assuming for the moment that at least some entities other than MSPs can operate DPs, because some of the models I'm showing will seem kind of moot if we don't assume that that's possible. If you assume that, like, the only people that operate discovery providers are in fact message service providers in that kind of full-on, more bottom-up federated model, then the distinctions here really break down. But imagine for the moment there are at least some entities that can do the discovery provider function that are not message service providers. And I kind of, as straw man here, looked at three high-level models. And again, I would encourage people to look at these models in terms of what are things we like or don't like about these that we might be able to turn into requirements that would go into the document. But the first model is entirely platform-driven, one where only MSPs talk to DPs and consume the authenticated mappings in a way that is invisible to users. Discovery happens whenever the MSP needs it. Could be at the time that consent has been established, could be at the time the message is going to be sent, but it's ultimately, again, to that conceptual model where I'm a user, I want to send a message to an SII, I type a message into Wire, that is directed to this SII, and I hit send, and Wire takes care of that. Wire talks to Discovery, Wire figures out what the right platform and or platforms are to reach that SII. And what I get back in my Wire chat screen is this just worked. And it's just like completely transparent to the user. So that's a user experience that a system like this could offer. Then I can imagine something that's more like user triggered, where, users effectively through that client server interface to their MSP which, as we know, in some sense is out of scope in Mimi. Exactly how much is, I think, a little up for grabs, but we're not here to prescribe internally how it is that clients and servers interact within these messaging platforms overall. But like something I do in that then causes the MSP to go out and do discovery, maybe through the MSP's interface, maybe through my app with them. I see results they got back from discovery. If I'm a power user, I could say, okay, if there's 3 ways for me to talk to Rohan, let's do WhatsApp. And that set of results is somehow at least available to users, and they are able to interact with the authenticated mappings that are returned by discovery, maybe even able to like validate them themselves in the crypto in them themselves if they felt like it. Rowan, do you want in before I get to the third one? Or should I do the third one first? Rowan, are you there? Am I still here?
I can hear you, John.
Sorry, my window just disappeared onto a different screen. I was frantically searching for a mute button. You can, yeah, I mean, I was going to comment on that second thing. If you want to finish, that's fine. Kind of up to you.
Yeah, let's do the third one real quick, because this I think makes it pretty clear, like what the distinctions are. Because in the third one, users have direct security and trust associations with the DPs themselves. Now, again, if the DPs are operated by the MSPs, this is more or less the same model as user triggered. So let's assume for the moment that DPs are there, at least some DPs exist that are separate from MSPs. And in this instance, it's really users who go out and as a client accumulate what the set of authenticated mappings are themselves. And when they then want to forge a new contact or send a message, they give that mapping to the message platform and say, this is the thing that I want you to execute it to. And in this instance, the user has like total control, right, over what the results of discovery are. So there are 3 like very different models. And again, I'm interested in what people like or don't like about these, or what properties they think these have that might or might not be beneficial. So go.
So I have an interest in making sure that we can cover a case that I've mentioned a few times, which is, let's say that I'm a salesperson and I have I have a content, like I have a work context where people can, I publish my address where you can reach me about selling real estate or stocks or whatever for my business. And if you're going to contact me about anything related to business, I really want you to use that address. At the same time, I don't want my, the mom of my daughter to send me messages about, the birthday party they're inviting me to on that messaging system. And so I think that it's reasonable. I want to be able to support this model where somebody says, hey, please contact me using this address, and I'm going to give you a URL or a QR code or a combination of, handle and service, handle and provider or whatever, where it's pretty clear that, even somebody who's not super technical can actually reach the right service in that context.
Yes.
So I just,
and previously I've said that I don't think that's discovery as we're discussing it, right? Because that is indeed the case where you have basically an SSI and you don't need this. There is going to be a slide in a second about user preferences and how those get negotiated, which includes discussion of context. And so I do think
the touch point that I'm concerned about is that this person doesn't want, they don't necessarily, like, either they want to completely opt out of the discovery picking the provider for them if someone searches for them based on phone number or email address, or they want it to, like, they don't ever want an automatic thing. They want to be able to have associated with, okay, I found some results for you, and here are the hints that were provided by the, by the owner of those, by the user that corresponds to that SIA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like I said, I think that mostly falls into the rubric again of this user preference and capability discussion, which we'll get to in a second. I thought this was a slightly more fundamental one than that, but I see why you say that it has an interaction, because in the platform-driven case, for example, that where all this is just being done automatically, what you don't want is for the platform to, give without consent mappings that, the recipient would never want to make available to clients trying to contact them. Totally agreed on that. And that is a requirement we should capture in this, definitely, is, that you should be able to opt out of discovery. Tim.
Thanks. So first, one quick clarifying question to Rowan, which is, in the scenario you're describing, are the business email versus like the personal thing, are those distinct SSIs on whichever MSP it is?
So, often small business owners are going to use the same phone number and have, they might have different email addresses, but they may desire to be searchable on their business address, even if that's not how they want to be reached for non-business things. So I don't think that, to answer your question, I don't think that those are different. Those are not different service independent identifiers.
Okay, interesting. Thanks. Then, sorry, separately from that, I was going to speak to the user-driven bullet on this slide, which is a scenario where, users are like, each client is what I'm inferring from this. Each client would be hitting like every discovery provider to figure out the mappings. I'm worried here about a setting where an MSP is a DP, and the case where you might be like unleashing the fire hose of a gatekeeper's users onto a relatively small messaging provider that may not be able to like handle that load. Whereas if the discovery requests are proxied via MSPs, then it's much easier, I think, for, say, the gatekeeper MSP to like cache some lookup results or otherwise limit exactly the amount of traffic that they're hammering a smaller DP with.
Yeah, and I mean, when you think of it just from a scalability perspective as well, right? I mean, do we expect, as we look at the DP as a function that's going to be architected, that every DP has an obligation to connect to potentially billions of devices, right? That it's going to have whatever necessary security association with. I'm sorry, got Giles very first. Did you have a comment on the last one before I dive into scalability?
Yeah, so I was just a clarification question to Rowan. Are you basically saying that we need to have a receiver needs to be able to set preferences on a per sender basis for who what client they receive on?
I think that a receiver at least needs to be able to say, don't automatically pick one of these for me. You can either say, there's a user here, but they want you to go contact them directly to figure out what service to use, or they're going to provide some hints that a human user can use to figure out which service to use. Mm-hmm. I would be okay with both of those.
I see. So you could have a sort of a global, in both those cases, you could have a global preference set that says like either everybody should contact me on this service, or everybody should ask me first before they decide, should ask me which service I want to be contacted on. And that would be a global.
Yeah, so I mean, it may be that you would have to say on, if you had multiple if your multiple DPs were on the multiple service, let's say I was really concerned about 3 specific services, so I've got my work, the service that I use for work, the service that I use for talking to my family, and then, a third service that I use for, some hobby community. So maybe rather than having to have something globally that's circulated to all the DPs by magic. Like maybe it's sufficient that I say that I have to go do something in my preferences in each of these services, so that each of those DPs knows independently that I want this. I think that's also okay.
Yeah, I actually think a lot of the more promising solutions I've considered to this problem, Rowan, have exactly that property. I've spent a long time trying to figure out any way that this could possibly work. And I believe that a lot of that is going to come down to that interaction between the user and then the MSPs themselves to make it work. But Giles, sorry.
But I'm not sure that gives you the property that you want of like basically being able to tell an individual user, hey, contact me on this type of service. I think you need some kind of like contact card mechanism where you can give your preference to a specific person.
But if I could, even before you get on this, Rowan, as I've continually said, that's not discovery. A process by which I give you a card that says, here's the right way to contact me, that is not the scope of this problem. And because that is solvable by me giving you a card that tells you how to contact me. If you have that, you don't need the discovery function as we've scoped it here, I think.
Fair enough. Yeah.
So
go ahead.
basically, Giles, like if I choose to sort of, if there's a card format that I can use, and I go to each of my each of my messaging service providers, and in my preferences I say, like, don't automatically select my service provider provide this card. Then somebody gets a thing and says, I can't pick this, but the user that you're trying to reach helpfully provided these instructions for how to reach them.
Yeah, but that's then a global thing that you can't.
No, but if each DP, like if I forget to do it on one of my messaging service providers and somebody happens to query that DP and it goes in the wrong place, I'm less worried about that than I am about there being no way for me as a user that wants to control where my messages are routed, that I have no way of affecting that.
But I'm much more concerned in this, though, by the n squared problem of because it's not just one card, different cards for different people, right? And like
exactly. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
And so, but to me, the answer to that is, okay, if you have different cards for different people, give the card to the person that, because you know who they are. If you could make a card that this is my Rowan specific card that shows here's the way Rowan should contact me, I can give it to Rowan, right? Yes.
So when I said card, what I meant was not like the sort of customized business card that you just described. I was thinking of here's the moral equivalent of the out of office email response that says, like, hey, I'm going to be like on a honeymoon for 8 weeks. If you need to get a hold of me about this, talk to this person about that, talk to this person. It's kind of like a routing card.
Yeah, but I think you also need something like, so I'm just in the middle of a conference. You need something that you can say like, here's my card. This tells you how to
figure it out. Yes. Yeah. All of those things are fine. Yeah.
Yeah. While I'm still in the queue, sorry, I had another point, which is, I don't see why at a protocol level we would want to choose between the third and the second and the third option. Like, that seems like something that would be a choice at the application level.
Well, I mean, so it's concerns like the scalability concern right here, in the sense of, we haven't talked much about what we think the security association is between a DP and somebody that is sending a query. And, I mean, I assume we think it's pretty lightweight, right? But especially as we start looking at these more federation-ish cases, there may be access restrictions of various kinds. There may be, like we've talked about, geopolitical constraints and things like that may govern what the responses are that a DP is eligible to give to a particular, query that's coming in. Like, I mean, these are things that do have like protocol level implications. Do we imagine when we talk about the DP functions, whether they are monolithic singleton down to, every MSP has their own DP, like, what do we think these are things that'll have associations with like potentially billions of devices, or do we think they will have, an association with whatever 100 or maybe 500 message service platforms? And, I'm not sure I have concrete answers to these. Again, I'm just trying to talk about things that I think surface what might steer us towards one requirement or another. But if people have thoughts about that, happy to entertain them here in the queue. When we talk about this possibility from the user-driven version where the user really talks to the DP and they get back this like logo drop-down menu list, is that something that we think is a feature of the protocol? Or is really that something more like in the user-triggered case where that is a feature of the client-server interface between user's client and their messaging platform? And, that's a question of what is the scope of the protocol that we need to build here, right? Because we're not going to be building that protocol that's between the client and, that's a UX, UI design issue between a particular messaging platform and the app that ends up on your Android device or something. But, if this is something that we need a query that will, then get down the information to individual users, that's like design work that we need to do. Maybe one of the most interesting parts of this, and we're starting to get towards the privacy and identity parts of this conversation, which if we can get past preferences, which we won't today, I suspect looking at the clock, we're going to talk a lot more about this. But there is a privacy property trade-off between these options as well, in the sense of, who it is that has visibility into the user's queries, how much of the social graph, for example, is revealed by this. In a case where, a client effectively disintermediates the messaging platform to talk to a DP, again, assuming that DPs and MSPs are not the same thing always for the moment, but doing a model where, the client goes out and gets that list of contacts, that may be much more sensitive from a social graph perspective than just the individual SSI, for example, that might result from whatever the user's interaction is with the target MSP, that the user then shares with the MSP to get a message routed to establish a contact. And like this question of where we think, because we all agree that, data minimization and getting like, user situation to be as private as possible is one of our most important requirements. Do people have strong feelings about this? I know Femi and I were literally just talking about this over email and Google Docs in the past couple of days about whether, it is better from a privacy design perspective for, MSPs to be the place that these queries happen, because then all the DP sees from the MSP is, hey, there's a request from one of my users for this, and it doesn't reveal much social graph? Or is it, preferable from the users contacting the DP directly because, in that instance, the MSP doesn't learn anything about who the user is trying to discover in these cases? Any thoughts about this? Because this is actually, I think, a kind of material one. Did people get that, first of all? Do I need to flesh that out further for people to understand the question, or? People have no feelings whatsoever about the respective? Do people think it's a wash and that basically the privacy properties there don't matter, and the distinction between those?
I mean, I think if we have IP blinding, that helps. I mean, it requires trust in the service. So if we can minimize the parties that get that need to be trusted there, that's even better. But like, I think if we can agree that the querier's IP should be hidden, that makes it a lot easier.
I mean, does anybody feel like IP blinding is off the table for some reason for these applications? Anybody here going to go to bat against using IP blinding for queries to the discovery function? People
I think
still
another
awake. Too long. Yes.
Sorry, just one more consideration here is that the MSP, in the case where you send a message, where you make a query and then you send a message, the MSP is going to learn the sender's identity anyway. So I think that personally gives me a slight preference for the MSP being the one that intermediates.
Because they're going to get the information anyway.
Well, yeah, if you send a message, yes. Tim.
Or probably do a contact like presence request or whatever, right? It doesn't even have to be a message, but just whatever it is you're sharing. Tim, what are your thoughts?
My feeling is that if we're talking about a threat model, and I think we are here as far as like privacy leaks, I think we have to assume that the attacker here controls both a DP and an MSP, unless we're going to take steps to like make it impossible to run both at the same time, right? We have to assume that the adversary is both.
Yeah, I mean, again, provided that we adopt a federation style model for this, I think that's certainly going to end up being true. Alyssa? Alyssa, are you back yet? Man, I think Alyssa is in that crazy taxi game. Well, we're waiting for Alyssa to connect and hopefully be able to share. Oh, there you are.
I got a green microphone. All I was going to say was that I think it's worth thinking about how to make the privacy properties of this consistent with the discussion we've been having about metadata privacy for the protocol itself. Like whatever it is that we're trying to achieve with that cannot be undermined by this. So obviously the DP is not involved in the protocol conversation, but I think it's worth aligning whatever we end up with, the requirements being for messaging itself needs to apply here, and I think that means a bunch of requirements in the MSP as the DP case for discovery.
Yeah, I mean, definitely we are under an obligation not to make the privacy story for end users any worse through anything we're doing with discovery. Hopefully we can even make it a little bit better. And, there's one final thing I'd add about the considerations on the user interacting directly with the DP is, the question, again, if we assume DPs, at least one DP exists in the universe that is not being run by an MSP, this question of how this interacts then with federations becomes kind of interesting, because you can imagine models in that case where users might discover valid authenticated mappings from a DP they talk to that point to MSPs that are not part of the federation that the user is actually like using for his messaging platform overall, and that could raise some potentially meaningful complications for this too. But I think with that, we're pretty much through what I wanted to talk about the user and DP case. I don't know if anybody has any final thoughts about this, or having had this conversation, does anything bubble up like, wow, here's a concrete requirement you can inscribe in this that like expresses my feelings about this? Any thoughts like that? I know that's a heavy ask, but definitely feel free to send things to the list. We don't need to even if we did have proposed text, we wouldn't want to wordsmith it here today. All right, well, we're making better progress than I thought. I thought 9 is as far as we would get, slide 9, which is where we are, and we actually have 15 more minutes. So I'm going to start talking about user preferences now. Ooh, this is where things get really hairy. Okay, so, we've talked already a bit, and we're not going to relitigate here, like how aware we want or need users to be of the overall discovery process. We've outlined a couple models where users are more or less involved in the interactions with discovery itself. But for those of us that have been around the IETF for a long time, and I don't know how many people here know SIP well enough to know what I'm referring to in the last bullet here is offer answer. There were a whole set of capabilities that were designed for SIP back in the day for expressing both user capabilities, and then when it really came time for people to communicate, for kind of finding what the overlapping set of capabilities they have are that they would then be able to share a voice or multimedia or text session through SIP. And so, it's something in that context that I think we've studied pretty extensively. And I think we know a lot about what some of the pitfalls around all that are and where the unexpected complexities can lie in it. But I mean, from a requirements perspective, really what a lot of this comes down to is, are we going to be putting requirements in a protocol that are going to entail that any protocol satisfying these requirements has a way for users to express capabilities that are somehow going to be authenticated and integrated into authenticated mappings, presumably, in order for them to be trustworthy. As we were discussing earlier, the bit that says this is my preferred service is a perfect example of why that can get quite complicated. But we need to look at this from both sides because it is effectively a negotiation. The sending user may have preferences which will determine which MSP a message should go to. I could imagine a user who, if they did get back that drop-down menu of potential options, would say, well, I'm certainly not going to use WhatsApp, and actually Signal isn't even good enough for me anymore. I want to use Session, and Session is it, right? Because I'm super paranoid. And you can imagine a way that those preferences could be executed at the client, much like everything we were just showing for the three models for user interaction with the DP. You could imagine where this is something that the user builds into the client, and the client is kind of responsible for seeing those preferences get executed. You could imagine it being something that the user communicates to their MSP. And there's some set of dialog boxes and things like that the user fills out that help them to determine what that the right thing should happen when the user tries to send a message. And finally, and this is maybe the hardest one for me to wrap my head around of these, user capability may be a factor in the sense of, if I'm trying to communicate with a particular SII, and I have a couple of applications that let me do it, is the job of sender preferences in this instance to find an overlapping set with the entity that I'm trying to connect to. So if I support platforms A and B, and the person I'm trying to connect to supports C, D, and E, maybe if it turns out we both actually support B, should we just connect over B? Or should we always go to an interoperability layer, right, between B, and C, or something like that? And I go back and forth over how well I think this corresponds to the spirit of the DMA, in that I do get the sense, at least, that the idea is that this interoperability layer will allow people on disparate platforms to communicate. But I still wonder, and I still pose the question to the group, do we think the job of sender preferences in this case might be to find what the set of applications are in which you overlap with the target, so that you can use those applications where you share accounts and everything else already in order to communicate? I guess I want to ask that up front. Is there anybody who wants to go to bat for that the job of discovery is to say, if John supports platforms like A, B, and C, and Rowan supports platforms C, D, and E, then there should be this kind of capability negotiation component of discovery that says, oh, John and Rowan both support C, so they should be talking on application C. Does anybody think that's the job of discovery? Does anybody think that's definitely not the job of discovery?
Yes, I do.
Do you think that is not the job of discovery?
Yeah.
Okay. Rowan, do you think that is the job of discovery?
I do not think that is the job of discovery.
Good.
And if somebody chooses to abuse it in that way, I'm not going to be terribly offended. But that's not what we're here for.
Well, so I mean, it does go back to these fundamental bias things, right? Because it's much more likely that you and I both support,
WhatsApp.
Facebook messaging, whatever, WhatsApp, than something Meta owns, right? Then that we support, we have that in common. Then that we have a bunch of, less gatekeeperish things in common, and that does seem to me, if we were just trying to develop a system that figures out what is the biggest gatekeeper in which we can both communicate, that we might not be exactly adhering to the spirit of the DMA.
Yeah, I'm good. I want to mention one other thing, though, which is that you asked us about the DMA, but the DMA basically has no requirement for discovery.
Oh, I got it. Yeah, I'm well aware. Yeah, it talks about users and being able to express their preferences, though, and things that are very similar to this, right? But yeah, I do understand DMA does not, as such, offer it.
Particularly because the DMA at the moment requires opt-in, which requires you to, requires the user that you're trying to reach to go and do some work to enable them to be discovered, or to be connectable.
Yes, we are trying to do better than that. Yes.
Thanks. Just for the benefit of the notes, to make sure that I get it down correctly, could I ask you to please restate the question that everyone was just responding to?
Yes, the question that I was just responding to is the job of the discovery process to find the intersection in the Venn diagram between the services that the sender and receiver of messages support, and to select something in that intersection. Is that helpful?
Yes.
And everyone said no. That's not what we're talking about. I just want to make sure that we're all clear about that, because I think if we weren't, then we could be designing a very different system here for sender and receiver preferences. Alyssa. If Alyssa's taxi permits. Giles, why don't you go, and then we'll come back to Alyssa, because she will join us momentarily, I'm sure.
Yeah, on reflection, I'm not only not against the overlap selection. I'm actively against it, because I think, like Femi pointed out, that it would incentivize people installing the kind of the common denominator apps even more than they already do.
Yes.
And I think we want to incentivize the opposite, which is like using interoperable apps. So
yes, we do. Right.
So
I just want to make sure we're clear, because
yeah,
yes, there's just a version of sender and receiver preferences that looks an awful lot like that. So I'm glad that we're able to rule that out. Yes, Alyssa, you up now?
Okay, I'm gonna try again. Well, first of all, just bumping up a level, and I'm sorry because I think my audio was breaking up, so you may have talked about this at the top when I missed a bit, but perhaps we could reflect on the experience of SIP offer answer and whether it achieved what people thought it was going to achieve at the beginning. I wasn't there at the beginning, but what I know of it is that it became extremely complex. Maybe you started out saying, really, we just want a simple mechanism to express a small set of preferences, which is certainly the direction I would lean for this. Start with something very simple that we think captures some portion of the use cases, and see if we can even design a thing which plausibly seems like it would work. Excuse me. And and have it be like maybe somehow extensible or not, depending on what people's reflections are from SIP offer answer. But that makes a lot more sense to me than trying to like explore the entire design space and come up with something super complicated. In that vein, what I got in the queue to say some time ago and didn't manage to say it is that I think let's like talk about the categories of the preferences a little bit. So we have senders and receivers, and then we have like preferences about which clients people like to use and preferences about which servers they want their communications to touch. So the sender, that's like a sort of a 4x4 matrix. The sender gets to choose their client by virtue of sending. So I'm not really sure what else there is to say about that. Like, I don't know why we would further consider the sender's preferences necessarily, other than to think about this question of like, the sender absolutely doesn't want their communications to touch the server of some particular provider. Maybe that's a case to consider, although that seems like, I don't know, I would put that at the bottom of the list of the requirements. Because why are you using interoperable messaging anyway? If you wanted that, like, you could just stay within your own service. So to me, it makes a lot more sense to focus on the receiver, because they're the person for whom like the choice of client isn't already made by virtue of the message being in transit. And that's the case where I think the receiver's choice of client, which then, kind of also dictates at least one of the providers involved, it makes a lot more sense to me. That's kind of the one square of the 4x4 matrix that seems like the lowest hanging fruit.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only wrinkles to that from the sender side are, again, when we start thinking about use cases that aren't just there's already a message in flight, but potentially I'm, negotiating consent for us to be contacts and sharing certain kinds of present information or whatever, right? Like where it may in fact end up fanning out, and you may have preferences about where you're sharing that information with or not. I can certainly imagine pretexts anyway that senders would make it more complicated, but I agree with you fundamentally that the sender's choice of kind of a home platform does make their decision simpler than the receiver's decision. But I wish this only ended up being 4x4 in the sense of the receiver side, because as has been raised previously in this conversation, there are concepts like context, like work or home or hobby or something. And like the idea that there is going to be some sort of a document that users are going to generate, or maybe it's just a set of radio boxes or something they fill out that results in a document being generated that is then signed in a way that relying parties should actually trust it, that expresses these communications. And Rowan's discussion earlier may indeed need to be customized on like a per potential contactee basis. Like, this is where this starts to get more into that very heavy complexity, I think, that we've explored on some of the fringes of offer answer and things like it in the past. Yes, Alyssa?
Yeah, well, I just think that's why it's worth thinking about like all these models that exist and have seen wide deployment, but maybe didn't turn out exactly as people thought from the beginning. And that includes SIP, but it also includes email, where you can't, there's not like a great internet-wide interoperable way for you to specify that you want your work email to go to your work email address, and people from work will email your personal email address if they have it accidentally all the time, right? Like, and that's like, does that mean email is not successful in terms of an interoperable messaging system? Like, probably not, right? So I think there's like a lot of trade-offs here, and we have a lot of models to draw from. So we should kind of think through what those models tell us about the trade-offs.
Totally agreed. And we are almost out of time here, but Tim.
Yeah, what I was going to say, and I'm going to do it anyway, is that if we're talking about like how rich, how sophisticated this representation of capabilities or preferences is, I'm worried about the point where we start saying like, well, let's allow a recipient to put like arbitrary content in there, because that becomes a serious vector for abuse, right? If you could put some like whatever harassment content in there or something.
Political speech,
like, or material that is like that violates laws in various jurisdictions, because then it's a mess. It's like, oh, now is my client stuck holding on to this content card that contains copyrighted, anyway, whatever. There's a whole can of worms there. And like, ideally this is, I think like Alyssa was saying, ideally this is just like a small number of bits that indicate something that is, I don't know, less controversial. But also, yeah, as you were saying, John, we're at the end of our scheduled time for today. So I think the upshot is that we'll have to pursue some of this stuff on the list and at the next Mimi interims, which fortunately we have a bunch more of these scheduled. So I think we'll close today with one, thanks very much, John, for leading the discussion today. And two, a reminder that the next Mimi interim, sorry, I haven't put it in my calendar yet. It's on May 8th, isn't it? Yeah, May the 8th at 9 a.m. Pacific. That's noon Eastern, and then I forget, 4 more hours in GMT. So please take a look at the Mimi meetings page for scheduling information and MeetEcho and so on. There's nothing explicitly on the agenda for that thus far, so I think we can pursue discussion. Pursue discovery. Go ahead, Ron.
I will have shortly in the next few minutes. I will have a new version of the content format that contains both the TLS presentation language and CBOR encodings.
So it sounds like you're asking to speak about that at the next interim.
I would like that.
Yeah,
doesn't need to be
yeah. So okay. The chairs will follow up with like an agenda.
May 8 is not good for me anyway.
Excuse me?
May 8 isn't good for me anyway. I got to be on a plane that day, so.
Oh, well, there we go. All right. Then in that case, it sounds like the plan record for May 8th will be to do content format and then otherwise go through open issues on the Mimi, the Mimi architecture and protocol docs. And then presumably we'll pursue discovery at the interim after that, which is 2 weeks after May 8th. Okay.
May 22?
That sounds plausible. Yeah, May 22.
Because May 23, I'm also traveling.
Yeah, that's Wednesday, May 22. Okay.
Okay.
Otherwise,
Cool.
if anybody has any other agenda items you'd like to see in an upcoming interim, please contact mimi-chairs@ietf.org and we will work with you to find you some time. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
All right. Thanks so
Good
much.
job, y'all.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
my pleasure. Bye-bye.